I want to thank you guys all again for coming here tonight. I really appreciate this huge turnout and everyone's interest in this important subject. I'm just going to talk for just a couple of very short minutes. And what I'd really like to hammer home is that solitary confinement is not something that's just happening in supermax prisons in other states. It's something that's happening here in Montana. And myself and my intake coordinator, Crystal, we have been to many jails and prisons throughout the state in the last year and talked to many, many people in solitary confinement. As you know, the estimate is about 80,000 people nationwide in solitary. And we don't have an estimate for people in Montana in solitary because it kind of depends on how you define it. The UN defines prolonged solitary confinement as 3 weeks or more. And if you work with that standard, there are many hundreds of people in Montana in solitary confinement. It's important to note that there are people in solitary here, both in jails and in prisons. So for example, today, Crystal and I were at the Missoula County Detention Facility, our county jail, and we talked to 2 inmates who had been in solitary, one for almost 1 year and one for 4 months. So even though our jail is not a supermax jail, it does have 2 pods where you have isolation cells. People are only out of their cell for 1 hour a day. And unlike CPS, what we just saw, they actually don't have even a rec room that they go to. Their hour out is just the day room right outside of their cell. The people that we spoke with today, as I mentioned, one of them hadn't seen fresh air or sunlight or anything like that for up to a year, and the other one for 4 months. And it's worth noting that both of the people we talked to today were both severely mentally ill. So you see this in jails throughout Montana. Our jail here in Missoula is not unique that it has this situation. But then when you look at our prisons, we have our state prison in Deer Lodge for males, and then we have our women's prison in Billings, and then we have our private prison. You go from a few months to a year to years and years and years in solitary. And again, we don't have a supermax prison in Montana, but what we do have in our men's prison, for example, are 2 locked housing units. So these are 2 buildings where all of the cells are solitary cells, and everyone is in their cell for 23 hours per day. Most of the people, I would say maybe a third of the people that we talk to in locked housing at the prison in Deer Lodge are severely mentally ill. And those who are not severely mentally ill are severely damaged by solitary. I think Crystal and I can both speak to the solitary eyes. You saw all of these close-ups of these prisoners' eyes throughout this documentary. And we've interviewed many people who, when you look at them, you can see their eyes. They're sort of like a caged animal. And there just is something different in the way that they look at you or don't look at you, and the way that their eyes appear. It's just noticeable, and it's pronounced. I also want to mention that we have a program called Solitary Stories, where we've been gathering letters from prisoners in solitary confinement in Montana and putting excerpts of their letters on our website. So if anyone wants to hear the actual direct experiences of prisoners in Montana in solitary, I would encourage you to go to the ACLU of Montana website and check out those stories. They are pretty powerful. And you'll really notice that there's the same themes that are happening. They live in a box. They have intense anxiety, paranoia. They become more angry. They become more hostile. So you really see a lot of the same uniform symptoms over and over again. And a couple months ago, I spoke with a man who had been in solitary for 5 out of the 7 years that he had been incarcerated, and he had been on and off in solitary and general population. And he explained to me how every time he went back to solitary, he was worse off, and every time he came out, it was harder and harder for him to come out and be back with people. And he was going to be discharging in a few months, and he had been talking to his mother about creating a room in her house where there's no sound, a soundproof room that has nothing but one color, because he was so concerned about having to process external stimuli that he was hoping to just find a quiet place. And when I suggested to him that it might not be good to create a solitary cell in his mom's house, he said, well, maybe down the road I'll be able to get out, but for now I just need to make sure that I don't explode. So, you know, in Montana you have people who are discharging out of solitary confinement, and they are just like the people that we see here. They're very nervous about it, and they are damaged. So from a public safety perspective, solitary really doesn't make a lot of sense, especially when you're discharging someone from solitary out to the public. I also just want to note that here in Montana, it's our policy that's established in our Montana Code Annotated that our sentencing should be rehabilitative. And as you can see from the examples today, it is non-rehabilitative to put somebody in prolonged solitary confinement. And as our speaker will talk about tonight, it's not that solitary confinement can't be used, but it can't be overused. And here in Montana, it's my belief that we overuse solitary confinement to the detriment of the prisoners, the corrections staff, and the public safety. So the common question that we get asked is, what do we do with these people? If we can't put them in solitary, where should we put them? And that's where our excellent speaker comes in tonight. We are very, very lucky to have Eldon Vail with us tonight. Eldon has spent 35 years in corrections in the state of Washington, and his career includes running the Department of Corrections for Washington for a number of years. And the really exciting thing about his tenure in Washington is that solitary was drastically reduced in his time in the Department of Corrections. He saw that solitary was detrimental, and he saw that it was overused, and he saw that there were options, and he got creative, and he worked with people within the department to bring it down. So what I think that Eldon really shows us is that prisoner advocates and corrections don't have to be on opposing forces. They can work together, they can be creative, and they can use studies like we saw here from universities. They can use the psychological resources that they have available to really understand and be honest about what impact solitary has and how everyone can benefit by moving to a model that makes a lot more sense. So Eldon, thank you very much, and we welcome you. We're glad you're here.
That's a very generous introduction. Not sure I deserve it. I guess we'll see. I think as much or more about my failures as a prison administrator as I do about my successes. But I think in the state of Washington, we did have some success, some limited success in managing solitary confinement, and that's what I want to talk to you about. That's also the third time I've seen that movie, and Josue gets me every time. Watching him struggle to be articulate, watching him control himself during that last strip search, that's somebody that you could have worked with. I mean, he wanted to live differently. He didn't want to live his life in handcuffs, and it's sad to see that he stayed there so long and entered the streets from that perspective. The other thing that strikes me about that movie is how much it is about respect. If you listen to every one of the prisoners talking, they were struggling to find some respect in an environment that didn't offer them any. And that struggle for respect, I think, is the key to trying to help people get out of those units and stay out of those units. It also occurred to me sitting here that I'm not a great speech maker. I haven't done a speech for almost 2 years. And then I was reminded of the last time I gave a speech, and it was to over 5,000 people, and it was at a funeral for a correctional officer who'd been murdered on the job at the Monroe Correctional Complex in the state of Washington. That was the first officer we lost in a line of duty in over 30 years. So maybe there's something about waiting so long to give another speech and changing the subject that'll help me work through my own career. But I'm going to start with some basics, even though that you just watched this movie that did a better job than I think I can do. I'll probably read a little too much, but I'll try not to do that. But I want to make sure that I cover my points. Solitary confinement is the practice of isolating a prisoner in a closed cell 23 to 24 hours a day, often for weeks or months, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades, with little human contact. What human contact does occur is when the prisoner's in restraints, as you saw in the movie, or through that slot in the door. Conditions of confinement are severely restricted. There's a minimal amount of property, not a lot of reading material. You can, in some systems, earn access to a radio or television. But the biggest thing, I think, and the hardest thing is that lack of human contact, even with other prisoners. Precise national data is hard to come by with exact numbers, but the number 80,000, 83,000, I think is the last number I saw, estimated in solitary confinement around this country. I'll weave in and out of some different languages here, and I would like not to, but I sometimes can't help it. And I'll use prisoner, I'll use inmate. Every once in a while I might slip up and use offender. I might even use convict, but I'm talking about the same group of people, those folks that are doing time in whatever prison system they're in. And also in terms of solitary confinement, supermax, segregation, as I use them, all those mean the same thing. As we've heard already, there are some prisons that are designed to be supermax facilities. That's all they do. That was the Colorado facility you saw here, which I've actually visited. But also, and where I come from, there are units within other prisons that are run in a supermax or solitary confinement fashion. There's a number of studies that suggest putting so many people in solitary confinement is a bad idea, but we rarely pay attention to that data, and we rarely ask ourselves what happens to the people who are in solitary confinement. And even less frequently do we ask ourselves what happens to the keepers of solitary confinement. One study, this one is out of Europe, found that inmates in solitary confinement developed psychopathologies at a rate nearly double from those in the general population. Another study found increases in self-mutilation by prisoners held in solitary confinement. A third found that individuals released to the streets directly from isolation had a recidivism rate 23% higher than those released from the general population. And a fourth study, this one from Washington State, where I come from, and I'm kind of proud of this study in a way, it found that inmates who had any assignment whatsoever to a supermax facility or supermax unit were more likely to commit felonies and crimes against individuals upon their release from prison. To quote a brief summary from the Vera Institute of Justice, the consequences of holding an individual in these conditions over time may include new exacerbated mental health disturbances, assaultive and other antisocial behaviors, and chronic and acute health disorders, and so on. The studies are really pretty clear that if you have folks who are mentally ill, they do not belong in solitary confinement. Then there's another body of work that is not always conclusive, it doesn't reach the same conclusion in every study, that says people who aren't mentally ill aren't caused to be mentally ill by being placed in solitary confinement. There's a mixed bag in terms of that group of information. But that doesn't mean they're not damaged. Prison has a criminogenic effect, and I think solitary confinement sort of amplifies that criminogenic effect in terms of making more individuals more angry and less able to cope in the real world. The study that they were talking about here, I'm pretty sure, has come out about a year ago, and it's very controversial. It showed an improvement in mental health for 20% of the prisoners held in solitary confinement in the state of Colorado. That study is very controversial, and people have spent a lot of ink trying to debunk its methodology and the conclusions that it's reached. So then we have our court system. And what do they say about solitary confinement? Again, every time this issue is litigated, the courts generally come to the conclusion that mentally ill do not belong in solitary confinement. The Eighth Amendment of the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and that's applied to prison conditions, including solitary. In Madrid versus Gomez out of Pelican Bay, the court ruled that for prisoners with pre-existing mental health conditions and for those with a high risk of suffering mental illness, being placed in solitary may be serious enough to constitute cruel and unusual. That's an instructive case, and I think people should use it as a guide when they're looking at their own situation. There's a case out of Ohio, Wilkinson versus Austin. It ruled that prisoners do have a protected liberty interest in avoiding placement in a supermax facility. In that ruling, the court required the prisoner be given a reason for the placement and have the opportunity to respond. After a decision is made, a short statement of reasons is provided, and they also need to have there needs to be meaningful periodic reviews about why people are in solitary confinement. In my experience, even in my own state, and I think across the country, those reviews aren't very meaningful, and the opportunity to appeal that finding doesn't have much substance. Internationally, the Council of Europe's European Committee for Torture stated that solitary confinement can rise to the level of inhuman and degrading treatment and should be as short as possible. The Committee Against Torture, the governing body of the Convention Against Torture, to which the United States is a party, They have recommended that solitary confinement be abolished entirely because of its potentially harmful effects on prisoners' mental and physical health. And in 2010, the American Bar Association proposed only the most severe disciplinary cases should lead to solitary confinement of more than 30 days with a limit of 1 year in all cases. Then in May of this year, actually I think it was June, the United States Congress had their first hearings ever on the use of solitary confinement in America's prisons, bringing focus to the issue by our elected officials that we have never seen before. Now, one legislative hearing may not mean that much, but I think it's a significant start. And for those of you who follow prison issues, if you know about the Prison Rape Elimination Act and the law that George Bush put in effect, I think about the year 2000, that is producing fundamental change relative to protecting prisoners who are in our country's prisons from sexual assault. There are standards in place, and that's making a difference. Perhaps that's the future of how we will learn to better manage solitary confinement. But one of the people that testified at the congressional hearing was Michael Jacobson from the Vera Institute of Justice. Vera has established a segregation reduction project and has engaged several states to determine how to reduce the number of prisoners in solitary. Mr. Jacobson's recommendations included, number one, the collection of national data on segregation, so we can get accurate numbers about who's there. Number two, a national study on the impacts of segregation to assess the costs of the use of the different types of segregation compared to housing people in the general population. Segregation is enormously expensive compared to a general population living unit. And third, the development of national standards on the use of segregation to encourage the field to adopt best practices. I'm also a little bit proud that Mr. Jacobson in his written work talked about some of the work being done in the state of Washington as a best practice, but we'll get to that a bit later. So, where are we? Why are we doing this? Why do we engage in this practice? To quote the ACLU, solitary confinement is inhumane and harmful. It wastes taxpayer dollars, and it jeopardizes public safety. I think the old saying is you keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different outcome. That in itself is a sign of mental illness. So I probably need to talk a little bit about myself, because that's how I'm going to get you to the point where I might know a little bit about this. I should start by telling you I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a psychologist. I am, or I was, a prison administrator, and now I'm doing a little consulting, a little bit of expert witness work. But tonight what I'm interested in is culture and leadership of corrections departments. I'm interested in what really goes on in solitary confinement units. I'm here to talk about some limited success we had in the state of Washington, and I'm here to pontificate about what might be possible in a realistic future for the use of solitary confinement in our country. As Anna told you, I'm not an advocate for the abolition of solitary confinement. Many inmates come to these units because they are being separated and punished for fighting, attacking officers, or other prisoners. I believe there is a need for such confinement to help make our prisons safe from physical assault and to contain those that are focused and prone to try and escape. But the use of solitary confinement should be limited to inmates engaged in that kind of behavior. But if you look closely at who is there and why they are there, that's not always the case. Limiting the use of solitary confinement to these kinds of cases brings into focus the complexity of managing a modern prison today. On the one hand, prison administrators are charged with making sure inmate-on-inmate violence is contained throughout their facility. On the other hand, they must make sure that the methods of control that they use do not inflict pain that is unnecessary. It's a delicate balance, and it's hard work. So I started off my career working in the juvenile system, kind of like a correctional officer / case manager, worked the floor with kids. That was a great job. I liked it. Used to take the kids fishing, play cards with them. I used to joke that I was the lowest paid professional basketball player in the world because we played a lot of basketball with the kids. But after 5 years of that, I found myself being promoted to a supervisory level in an institution that converted to an adult facility. And that's how I got into adult corrections. The moment I got into the adult corrections, in the state of Washington at the time, the prison system was pretty out of control. And I actually brought some Life magazines, if anybody wants to look, from the 70s, if anybody wants to look at them afterwards, that shows the conditions in the state pen at Walla at the time. Inmates were pretty much running the place. The 60s had produced an ideological shift in in who we are as a people, and it got into the prison culture. They appointed a resident government council with enormous power. They had their own budget. It all kind of sounded good on paper, but in reality, it was a catastrophe. I think there was something like 3 murders at Walla Walla in the 60s, and in the 70s, there was 25. Violence skyrocketed, beatings, homosexual rapes. It was really crazy. So I came into the system right when the state was trying to get control of that institution, and what was going on there had sort of bled over to other facilities, no pun intended, and the whole system was a mess. So one of the things that the folks in charge did at the time, 2 things actually, is that they built the first Supermax unit in our state, and they built it at Walla Walla. And they said to the inmates there that were causing all the problems, we have a place where you're going to live and you're not going to be able to do that stuff anymore, so here's one choice. On the other hand, about that same time, they established a conjugal visiting program and said, for you guys who want to stay out of trouble, this is a significant incentive. You can spend the weekend with your wife, your kids, your parents, whatever it is. That was an important lesson for a young corrections person to learn. More repression was not the single solution. It was a carrot and a stick approach, and that, plus a whole lot of other work, I think really did work to begin to turn the system around and instruct the staff throughout the state that it takes both hands in order to make change. It's not just more repression. So you fast forward that time. Now it's the early 90s, and it's the 3rd facility that I was appointed to be superintendent, and it was Mcneil Island Correction Center. Mcneil Island was the last true island prison in the country. Rikers doesn't count because it has a bridge to it. We've since closed McNeil. That's a whole other story. But I came in at the time when we had an old cell house there, 5 stories high. It was actually, the blueprints from McNeil is what built Alcatraz, so that gives you a sense of how old it was in the early 90s. And it was horrific. I mean, you had no idea what was going on in that cell block. Some of the cells held 10 people. So anyway, I came in and we were knocking that down and building 5 new direct supervision living units, which are really important. But they also added for me a Supermax unit with way more beds than I needed. So back to culture and leadership, I had the privilege of working for a gentleman by the name of Chase Reveland. And if you've done much litigation in this area, and I don't know how many are active or how many of you are studying, but Chase has been special master in several cases in the state of California. Since he retired from the state of Washington, he does his job as an expert witness. He wrote a primer for the National Institute of Corrections on what Supermax should look like, and it's full of questions that, do you really need this? And if so, how are you going to run it? He's really an interesting person who not only was concerned with staff safety, but he was focused on community safety, and also really got the joke about the responsibility of corrections administrators to care for and provide services for the people that the state gave us the responsibility to incarcerate. So he asked me at McNeil. At that time, we had 144 beds for the mentally ill in the entire system, and I had this opportunity, opening a new facility, to work with 1/3 of that Supermax unit and one of my general population pods and offer an alternate program for the mentally ill. And it was actually very successful. We were able to, we had the secure environment, we had the softer general population. Most, other than it had a medium perimeter fence, most jurisdictions would probably call it a minimum security environment. The offenders had keys to their rooms, for example. But we did a really good job at helping guys not live in such high security and moving out into general population. But none of that's really the point. The point is that we did this in partnership with the University of Washington. He established and got funded a collaboration with the University of Washington that brought them into our agency. It was the Department of Psychiatry, the School of Nursing, Public Policy. There was representatives from 4 or 5 different agencies, and they came in and helped us design this living unit. And it is out of that partnership, and now I begin to get to the point, that we learned more about how to manage our Supermax population. I did most of that without reading it. I think I got it covered. I'm much better interacting, honest. So, the long-term result of that partnership was this book. I have no fiduciary interest in this book. But this is a great book. I really like it. It's called Total Confinement, and it's by Lorna Rhodes. Lorna was an anthropologist who was attached to this partnership. So it's a really interesting look at what goes on in those units, not only with the prisoners, but also with the staff. And it's not simple. It's not one thing. The staff aren't all bad. The inmates aren't all bad. Everybody has a complex story to tell. She wrote this book, in part, I think. I was the superintendent of McNeil Island. I had this deputy superintendent, Gary Jones was his name, and he had this remarkable ability to get to that issue of respect. When you live in that cell 23 hours a day, everything's magnified. And some of the guys in the film talked about that magnification. They were very insightful. And so when the staff comes and does anything to you through that door, it takes on extraordinarily deep meaning around the issue of respect, often. And somehow, and nobody ever did figure this out, Gary had the ability to be on the outside of that door and talk through it to that person and let them know he felt their pain, if nothing else. And this is a tough guy. This is a guy out of Walla, ex-correctional officer. This is not a social worker from out of the business coming into the business. This is a guy who is very much part of the business. So what I asked Lorna and another guy by the name of David Lovell, would you follow Gary around, figure out what he does, articulate it, and we'll build it into the training curriculum. When they got done with the book, when they got done with the project, they didn't know how to do that, but they wrote the book. So anyway, it was an extraordinary experience. Lorna studies the internal logic of the prison from both a prisoner and a staff perspective. She tries to understand the contradictions in the work and where they might exist where there might exist openings for the possibility of change. In doing so, she tries to connect the everyday events in prison with our national assumptions about how people do not, will not, or cannot change their behavior. She makes a clear delineation between the mad and the bad, the mad being those held in solitary who are mentally ill with an Access 1 diagnosis, and those in solitary who have character disorders or an Access 2 diagnosis. She has no illusions about the danger to others some of those folks represent, but throughout the book she's able to illustrate how some of what happens in solitary produces the actual opposite of what the state hopes to achieve. She talks about how an emphasis on control over the body can work to secrete its opposite. In the supermax setting, it is not only prisoners' bodies that are tightly managed, it is attention itself. The moment when one human being notices and responds to another, that's administered, it's guarded, if you will, and it's applied sparingly. She talks about what happens to the persons who live behind those steel doors with little human contact and how hard it is to cope with those living conditions. And she watched Gary be able to somehow understand what that feels like and communicate that empathetic understanding to other administrators throughout the state. So it was a couple years later. Now I'm an assistant director in prisons, and we're having problems at one of our facilities in the Supermax unit. And the staff are coming to work every day, and they're wrestling with people, and they put their combat gear on, and it's really, really a bad situation. The unit's being damaged, significant property damage, people are getting hurt. So we sent Gary Jones over there and had him take control of that unit. And he came in and basically changed it and began to change the whole system as a result. The main thing that he did as a deputy superintendent is that he took all of the prison leadership around cell by cell more than once a week to talk to people who were in there to find out what their issues were. And he solved the smallest problems. He gave them respect. My mom hasn't written me. I don't know if she's okay. Can you please check for me? I can't get a new toothbrush. They won't. So by doing that, he modeled for the staff who worked in the unit that there's a different way to go about interacting with these folks that actually calms them. And you see the folks here all suited up, ready to go in. And when you're ready to go in, you need to be suited up to try to make sure nobody gets hurt. But rather than do that quickly, Gary would say, he's not going anywhere. He hasn't cut himself. Let's talk to him. Let's wait him out. Let's see what happens. Let's see if there's an issue of respect that we can connect with, calm him down, and not get anybody hurt. Then he got even more innovative, and he said, these people don't have enough to do. Let's get them some programs. Let's get them some education. Let's get them some drug treatment. Let's bring in some cognitive behavioral therapy, and not do it through the cell door. What he did looked horrible. He went to the maintenance shop, and he built what are basically cages. and he put them out in the day room, and he brought guys in there, but he worked 5 or 6 at a time with an instructor from outside the unit, some of them from inside the unit, and they were able to have other human contact structured around pretty positive activities. And the most controversial thing he did, and I heard a lot about this, is that when folks graduated from those programs, he'd have celebrations. But that's what happens. I mean, the research on punishment versus reinforcement is you need, I think it's 4 pats on the back to 1 kick on the butt if you actually want to change behavior. He got that and did it there. So we had him sort of go on the road and do the best he could to communicate that to the other prisons that had supermax living units. Meanwhile, we continued to work with the University of Washington. We worked with them on projects, and then they did research, and I'll give you some highlights of that. The first thing they did when we asked them to move from mental health into the supermax was they conducted a study to help us understand who exactly did we have in those living units. And what we learned is that everybody in those units is not the same. We found too many mentally ill. We found those folks that were there just for protection. And while, I've been sued for not protecting people who got beat up in population. That's certainly an issue, but I'm not sure that solitary confinement is the answer. Nobody wants to run a protective custody unit. And in a state as small as Montana, it's probably hard to hide them in another prison, but still there are other alternatives than solitary for someone who simply needs protection. We found youngsters with poor impulse controls. We found prison businessmen, if you will. These are guys who've done a lot of time, who are doing the kinds of things that convicts will do. They'd get caught, they'd get sent there for a while and have to do their time, just a part of doing business. We found another group of people, and this was kind of interesting. These are guys who also had a long period of time and had been relatively stable, but if you charted their prison progress, the longer they were in prison, the more their behavior deteriorated, and the more often they were winding up in solitary confinement. And then we found another group of people who were just simply at war with the system. And I can't remember the gentleman with the big glasses, but he was at war with the system. And, going from 12 to 96 years, I mean, what a story that is. So they did that study. They helped us figure out who was there, which began to help us figure out what else we could do with them. We also did something called the mobile assessment team. We used folks from the university and our own psychologists and custody staff, and we went around from outside the facility with a group of experts to come in and look at an individual case to figure out what's going on here and what can we do to work this person out of solitary. It was a really interesting program, and they produced piles of documents. We finally abandoned it because it was too expensive. I mean, these assessments were costing us thousands of dollars, but we got some really good work out of them. And we learned from that process as well, maybe a little bit about how to do that better ourselves. Then we asked them what to do, and this is a study I referenced earlier, what happens to folks who have been in solitary after they're released to the community. And they didn't really come up with, able to point to causality, but the research clearly showed an association between placement in solitary and a higher risk of recidivism. And then finally we thought, okay, we've done the research, we've done some projects, we did other ones as well. How do we get these people out of there? So we asked them to work with us to establish step-down programs at a couple of our institutions. One of them, Walla, that's our state pen. In Washington, we call close custody general population. That's the highest custody level you can have and not be in segregation. There's only 2 facilities that do that in Washington at the time, Walla and Clallam Bay, and they're opposite ends of the state. So we asked them to help us figure out how to get people out of here. The components of those programs were driven, I think, off of what Gary did at the institution that he was at, which is a different facility. There was an emphasis on cognitive and mental health intervention, regular, meaningful visits by top staff of the institutions. Each of these programs operated somewhat differently, but both were based on the research about social learning. They moved aggressively to put prisoners in contact with one another as they attempted to understand how their own behavior could be changed to keep them out of solitary. The program at Walla required a timeline self-analysis that reviewed had the individual review their prison records and analyze their choices at each juncture. And the program at Clallam Bay proceeded with a cohort of about 5 or 6 inmates. So they joined the program together, they worked together, and they only advanced when they all advanced. So that was an interesting social learning experiment that continues to this day. The university documented the outcomes and also with control groups. It wasn't just talking about the folks who were going through these programs. And the result is that graduates of the two programs were 4 times more likely to succeed at staying out of solitary than those in the control groups. That was remarkable success. It's a little bit sad for me to report that the program at Walla Walla did not survive. The global economic crisis that every state has experienced impacted our budget greatly. And because of some prison construction at that facility and the need to reduce costs, we pulled away from that program because we couldn't afford it for the short run. But also because the culture at that facility fought against it. I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but the program at Clallam Bay continues, and it's producing better results than it did at the time of the University of Washington study. Over 80% of the people who go through the step-down program at Clallam Bay don't go back into solitary. And these are some guys that spent years in solitary confinement. These aren't folks who are in for 3 weeks or 3 months. These are some really hard nuts to crack. As I conclude my comments tonight, I want to talk about a couple more things. One, why the culture at Walla Walla did not support the step-down program, because I think that's instructive for those who want to embark on a similar reform, and two, why the program at Clallam Bay did. First, Walla Walla, and I think this is applicable to any jurisdiction that wants to deal with this issue. You must spend time and energy on the staff that do not work in the program to help them understand what you are doing and why you are doing it. To quote from the study itself, because the step-down program addresses men who have caused trouble and injured staff and other inmates, staff are naturally going to be suspicious because it may seem that participants don't really deserve help. In addition to providing specific evidence of a program's safety benefits, it is important to be clear about the connection between genuine accountability and the program's premise of respect for the participants' capacity for rational choice. It is common to defend treatment programs that good treatment by arguing that good treatment is good custody. So common that one must wonder why this argument isn't more effective. Part of the answer lies in specific evidence, such as that presented here, meaning the study, that a program improves safety and security by helping offenders change dangerous behavior. The paradox, however, is that participants accepted the program because its message was not about what the institution needed, it was about respect. We're offering this program because we think it will meet the needs that you can recognize as your own, at least once we take the time to work through what matters to you. It's a quote from one of the therapists who worked in the program. While it is natural to classify this approach as a form of help, this term is misleading for two reasons. To offenders, it may suggest that staff know what's good for them, a suggestion unlikely to carry conviction with the kind of men who join the program. To staff, it suggests that we want to do something good for these people, but what they have done to others makes it hard to think they have anything coming to them. What is lost in this argument, of course, is the distinction between respecting a person's point of view and accepting what they do. Clallam Bay avoided this pitfall, I believe, because of the stability of the leadership at the facility, most notably the person who runs the unit. And I hate to say this, but too often really successful programs are linked to the charisma of individuals. Guy's name was Steve Blakeman. He's a corrections veteran. He's ex-military, and he was emergency response team commander. Again, this is a guy with deep in-custody background before he took on the assignment of running the Supermax unit there. I interviewed him last spring for another project, and I asked him why he thinks this program continues to be a success, and here's a little bit of what he told me. It's the culture. And if you do this right, disruption to the unit's culture must occur. He's talking about moving into the unit as a new leader. One small example, staff language is critical. You start with simply insisting that it be professional at all times, and then you slowly move it to the point where every interaction between staff and prisoner is an opportunity to model pro-social behavior. It is equally important for the staff to understand that change is the responsibility of the inmate. This is not a program that blames the staff. The goal must be to disrupt the role behavior that the inmate is locked into and offer him a different vision of what the future might look like. No one wants to live their life in handcuffs, and we use that motivation to help the inmates establish the self-control necessary to make it in general population. Inmates have to believe that change is possible. And I would add, inmates, whether in solitary or in general population, are just like the rest of us. They need to have hope. So, excuse me, time for my recommendations for reducing the use of solitary confinement, and I actually have a dozen of them. Number one, it starts with leadership. Leadership must understand and accept the extraordinary responsibility their staff and institutions have over the body of the incarcerated person. They are charged with both the safety and the care of the prisoners being confined, but also must understand that the perception of legitimacy of authority is gained by the way in which they respond to the needs of individuals. Leadership needs to be in the units, interacting, guiding, and demonstrating that understanding. Number two, know who's in solitary and decide if they really need to be there. Like I already said, get the protective custody inmates out. Mentally ill inmates belong in a mental health unit. The alternative is to flood the supermax with mental health staff, but that's not as effective, and in my own experience, we really struggled making that work. Number three, the decision to place somebody in solitary confinement must have outside review. It cannot stop at the institution. And if the department's not responsible for doing it, I think at some point the courts will step in. Number four, assessments for those placed in solitary must be quick, thorough, and ongoing. Individuals have very different reactions to being held in isolation, and interventions for those struggling must be rapid and meaningful. A lot of damage can be done very quickly to people at the moment they're put into isolation. Level systems, I think they called it the quality of life program here. I'm a fan of level systems, but you should not start the prisoner off at level 1, the lowest level. It makes no sense from a simple understanding of human behavior. To the degree that deterrence has an effect, individuals still need to believe they have something else to lose. Number 6, conditions of confinement, this is the hardest one for correctional people, in solitary should not be the same. One size does not fit all. There needs to be an internal risk assessment for those placed in solitary that differentiates individuals into smaller groups. All conditions of confinement need to be built around the level of human interaction that can safely be allowed. More human interaction, not less, is what is called for to blunt the destructive impacts of solitary. I see a parallel to the emergency room. People who wind up in solitary are in distress, and the antidote is to help them regain self-control, and that can best happen through structured interactions with other human beings. We did not get this done in the state of Washington. I don't want to claim that we did, but they're talking about it, and it's one of the recommendations that Vera made to them, because Vera is working with the state of Washington now. Number 7, staff in those living units must be the most professional that the agency has to offer. Respect, concern, and care within a safe environment are the goals. Pay them more and make selection for these units highly competitive. Working in Supermax today degrades custody staff. Raise their skill level and expect them to work more effectively. Number 8, eliminate mandatory minimums. That be good for so long and we'll let you out. While the assessment of individual behavior is important, it needs to be nuanced and seen in the context of the individual and their progress in their individual program. People should not be kept in solitary for violations that wouldn't have gotten them there to begin with. The research on swift but certain punishment should be informing how long people stay in seg, and the research is very clear. It's not the length of the punishment, it's the certainty that it will occur, and that's really not being used in our solitary confinement units around the country. Number 9, there must be programs, mental health treatment, anger management, conflict resolution, and my favorite, cognitive behavioral therapy. They need to be offered in heavy doses. Programs should be delivered in group settings, however you can get that done. Number 10, level systems need to parallel what we have learned about reentry. Because if you think about it, that's really what it is. You're reentering the general population from this isolated confinement. If you can imagine living in your bathroom for a day, or a week, or a month, or 6 months, or a year, or 5 years, and then opening the bathroom door and you're standing in the middle of the freeway, that's what it feels like for people coming out of solitary confinement. There needs to be a process of systematic desensitization to work people out. You can't just throw them like this poor guy in the movie. That's the worst thing you can do. Number 11, once you have communicated and are establishing the kind of unit that you want to run, you must involve the line staff in delivering services and to having them help you evaluate and understand the individuals who are living in the unit and how they're doing. Once on board, they will be most helpful in defining the future iterations of the program. Given clear direction, these line staff are critical to help agency leaders understand what is working, what is not, and what needs to be done to achieve a set of more enlightened goals. Number 12, last and probably not least, all of this does not happen very fast. I feel like I've had the privilege of working in a relatively healthy culture, although that's kind of a non-sequitur to begin with, correctional system. And I think there's a 20-year history to produce the progress we've made in Washington. If you don't want to see the effort fail, you must understand how critical institution and unit culture are if meaningful change is to occur. I'm going to end tonight with a quote from Lorna Rhodes' book. Buy it, but I don't make no money off it. She is writing here about the experiment at reforming solitary confinement that she witnessed and wrote about that involved Gary Jones. And that's the last chapter of the book. It seems to me that the staff and inmates of the setting I have described here are stubbornly enacting a hope constructed out of the historical specifics of their situation. And having been largely without it, they do not want to give it up. They draw on the fact that an institution is inhabited by a multitude of positions and voices. On close inspection, neither alliance nor enmity is quite as simple as it seems, and individuals can almost always tell more than one story, sometimes contradictory, about themselves. Failures of imagination, then, may be failures to see how many imaginations are at play and how they might, in fact, struggle it out. If we cannot escape our history, we might at least make better use of it. I am not willing to give up the hope suggested by these efforts. Thank you. Questions, comments?
Yeah, you had the comment as far as getting people with mental illness into a mental health unit. Would you see that within a correctional prison system? Or would you see that? Is it all? Or would you see that in a forensic hospital?
Well, ideally, I'd like to see everybody who's mentally ill in a forensic hospital. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So, again, from my own experience, what we did in Washington, we have a 400-bed facility that's basically an inpatient hospital. And one of the units, I think it's only 36 beds, is run very high security, but it's run by mental health staff. And they're surrounding those folks with human contact, not the withdrawal of it. I don't know that this country has the political will to house prisoners in forensic environments. And when we've tried to do that, it hasn't worked in recent memory. But in an ideal world, I'd love to see that. But that's not what our hospitals are equipped to do these days.
Anybody else have it? Oh, that is so loud.
Does anyone else have any? All right. Heather, whisper something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I've done about 11 years in prison, and I did about 3 years of that in solitary confinement. Watched 5 people die in the Montana State Prisons, their worst riot in solitary confinement unit, and started doing solitary confinement when I was 14 years old. But I think, I don't know, I ended up coming here to university, almost graduated, about 20 credits short, but I think, that, because I did do some work on my own when I was in there. I did this thing called CLEP, College Level Entry Program, which I did in myself. And I did some extension courses that helped me learn table manners, just small things, how to interact in society and stuff. And so I ended up doing some of those, and then just, all we had was a Bible and play chess through the doors, call out our games and stuff, but, I don't know, because I have gone back to prison many times. And since 1990, I've been back to prison, I don't know, 6 times maybe, and But I'm done with all my prison now. Been out for, we're done with it for a couple years now. But, but I see, like a lot of people, young ones going in there, and you see them in jail, and they're real easy to identify, the ones in jail that are going to go on to prison, and they're going to be in solitary confinement for years on end, because they got 40, 50, 60, 100 years. They don't have no hope when they leave county jail, and the first thing they want to do when they get to the prisons or wherever they're going is hurry up and do something, and make a name, or get in with their gang or whatever they're going to do, and to get their security, sense of security in there, And I don't know, is there a possible thing that you could do to kind of like weed them out before they even get to prison? Because because when you're looking at 40 years when you're 20 years old, I mean that's a lifetime, and I see a lot of guys in there right now that want to commit suicide and and just want to throw their whole life away, and I just I don't know, I maybe before they get to prison, that you could try to identify some of them or have some kind of program.
You have a lot more to say on this subject than I do, sir. I wish I could give you a complete answer, but the amount of money that we invest in the juvenile system and the prevention programs is money well spent. And I think, I'm not sure about Montana, but I think it's one of the states that's decreased their juvenile population because they've invested in community alternatives. That needs to happen more. These problems get solved sometimes through litigation, but they also get solved through education. And again, I feel lucky coming from a state where we have educated a number of elected officials, and they want to put their money in prevention. They don't want to build another prison. They want to put their money into programs. They don't want to build another prison. And I think that's the right direction, but there's not easy or simple answers to this. What I wound up being charged with is the other end of that. You get those young men who do come in, and the culture is so macho that they've got to prove themselves. They've got to get where the gang are. They got to be mission boys and hurt somebody to prove who they are. And there's not one answer. We did a lot of things, and again, it's the luxury of having more than one facility. When I took over as secretary in Washington, there was 15 prisons. When I left, there was 12 because we closed 3. But those prisons have very different identities. The state pen is what you expect. It's the state pen. But we've got some big facilities that are light medium, and they're heavy doses of programs, and there's lots of visiting, and we bring the families in. There's dogs in every prison in the state of Washington now. There's experiments in sustainability with frogs and butterflies, and it sounds silly, but if you can get people who are doing time involved with anything else that's alive, it has a calming effect, and it's an incentive to work towards it. I'm a great believer in conjugal visits, and I think there's only 2 or 3 states left in the country that do that. So once you get that situation, you still have to strive to try and find hope for some people so that they can get out of that rut. We'd go to guys at reception who were serious gangbangers, and we'd say, looking at your scoring and who you are, you're headed for the pen at Walla. But if you could, we're not even asking you to renunciate or anything. If you could just step back from that gang stuff while you're here, we might send you to Airway Heights in Spokane, and you can work in correctional industries, and you might get a dog, and you can, with some people that work. Other guys just blow you off and say, no, man, send me to the pen. That's where I belong. It's not simple. It's hard work. It's great to hear you're doing what you're doing now, though, sir.
Litigation can only accomplish so much, and it really can't change the culture. And it takes the prison industry recognizing and acting on the science that you have. We haven't proven that this causes the opposite effect. And so how do you actually change the culture? I don't know what I do.
I got your question.
Sorry, how do you actually change the culture? How can you, as part of the prison industry and prison industry itself, self-regulate instead of relying on ACLU and other people to be outraged and litigate?
Well, I'm going to answer that, but then answer it 2 ways. I would like to think that for the most part, that is what I did. And I came out of a culture of leadership leadership where Dr. Chase Riga, when he would face litigation, he saw that oftentimes as an opportunity to produce policy changes that he otherwise couldn't pull off, to drive funding for a program. And that's how I learned the system. So by the time I'm secretary, I had one class action suit, individual suits, but one class action suit. And I think Washington is that system. Other systems, other states, it's not that way. But the second part of my answer to you is that it's a political world. And we've got elected officials in the state of Washington that if I wanted to close down the conjugal program, they know the research, they know the history, they wouldn't have let me. It's not something I tried, but if you get engaged with the forces who pass the laws, it can make a difference. People think that's always liberal Democrats. There's a whole website out there, it's called Right on Crime. And it's people like Newt Gingrich and really conservative people looking at the science, saying we shouldn't be incarcerating so many people, we should be providing them treatment, on and on and on. So citizens need to get involved. And as more and more people are incarcerated, they have someone in their lives touched by that system. And I've seen people be able to turn that energy into political motivation, and they do have an impact. I think ultimately it's a political world. You need to have good leaders. You need to train them. How you do that, and I don't know really anything about Montana, how you do that absent the either political will or the will of the leadership of the agency is beyond my capacity. Sure.
How would you characterize the federal approach to these issues? Is it more enlightened, less enlightened, more ideological?
I don't want to speak beyond what I know, but the federal system's so big, and it's all over the country. I know that their facility in Colorado is facing some serious litigation now. The feds tend to be sort of really rigid and militaristic in their approach, and they don't feel constituent pressure as much as you feel at the state level. So it's easier for them to kind of stiff-arm issues. They're usually not in front, but they're also not in the back of what's emerging in correctional trends. They're probably, maybe a quarter of the way back. So they get there, but they get there slowly. But it's so big, and I can't speak with any confidence about different facilities. Here and then here.
When you're over in Washington, on the high side, did you offer educational programs, technical skill training, or was that just considered for the inmates on the low side?
You mean like in solitary? Did we offer education programs?
That,
Yes.
or even just on the high side?
Yeah, no, we had a fairly robust, we lost some program dollars in budget cuts too, but we had a fairly robust program, especially basic education. We were serving 93%, we were meeting 93% of the need for basic education based on our assessment scores coming in. That's pretty good. If you got everybody but 7%, those are probably people who didn't want to go anyway, or we couldn't motivate them to go. We were meeting about half the need for drug and alcohol treatment when I left, so there's still a huge need there. The cognitive programs that I speak of being so fondly of, I wish I could have done more. In terms of return on investment, they're one of the highest returns and they're relatively inexpensive. And that's just helping people with thinking errors. It's not real hard, but it's effective. So, yeah, it's a fairly robust program environment. But still, there's a great deal of idleness. There's a lot, there's too much time that people have on their hands. You don't ever get to the point where you'd like to be. But I always figured that guys who were going to school or working in industries or going to drug and alcohol class or who had a dog or were working out in the nursery growing the organic gardens, they were much less likely to be trying to figure out how to hurt somebody or get dope in. Good treatment is good custody. But it's hard to have enough resources so that everybody receives it. There's a question up here.
I don't understand why solitary confinement isn't considered cruel and unusual punishment. How has it not been banned by our courts?
Well, again, I'm not a lawyer. I think the courts have given broad deference to corrections people, and if you read some of the language out of the U.S. Supreme Court, it's kind of scary in that regard. I don't see that happening anytime soon. But I have to put on my other hat of running the system and winding up in the middle of a lawsuit where a man who was repeatedly violent And we had lots of evidence of that. Wound up in a general population living unit and beat another inmate to the point where he was put into a coma and won't ever be the same again. There is sometimes a need for very secure housing. I don't think, though, that you just put them there and forget about them. It's like an emergency room. You pay more attention to them when they're in that situation, and you try to find whatever angle it is, whether they're afraid, whether they're mentally ill, whatever the issue is, you try to find some way to intervene to help them regain control of their behavior. I certainly wouldn't disagree with someone who reaches that conclusion, but I also know what it's like to try and run a prison system with all these different mixes going on. Yeah. He's going to make you use the mic.
Hello. Yeah. I have questions about the system.
Sure.
You have brought up on a number of occasions like liability, lawsuits, and that sort of thing. How much, first off, are we looking at the general insurance industry when we look at prison insurance? And if so, how much do they have an impact on the kinds of latitude that someone like you has in your ability to change policies?
Boy, that's a question that you need a local attorney to answer about the state of Montana. But here's what I know about where I come from, and that the tort liability window in the state of Washington is extraordinary across the country. And I've had my attorney general say that, and I've been in rooms full of corrections administrators. They've waived any kind of sovereign immunity. There's strict liability. And so it's always been in the forefront of my mind as we make decisions, because it has to be. It's a very difficult situation in the state relative to getting sued. And I'm not talking about class action litigation in federal court. I'm talking about personal injury. The person who got hurt because I should have protected him. The person who was murdered on community supervision by someone who was on supervision. It's a very different situation in the state of Washington. But it did cause us, on more than one occasion, to make decisions based on our concerns about liability and not necessarily what was best for public safety. There is no insurance. The state of Washington is self-insured, so it comes out of their own dollars. There's nobody that would take that insurance. Nobody would offer that insurance in a state with that wide open liability. Well, no, that's not true. That is not true. There is some Lloyd's of London stuff back there somewhere, but that's so deep in with the people that write the check, I don't want to misspeak because I don't really know.
Well, I was getting more at the concept of risk.
Right.
Risk assessment.
Yeah.
Cost and benefit. Having an impact on the kind of policies that you like to see with regard to, in this case, the solitary confinement of an individual who could do harm to the staff or other prisoners. And how does that inform or include things that you have seen in your lifetime in this, I hate to say it.
Yeah, it's a business. Yeah. That's a really good question. The risk assessment work that's done for correctional populations is done at the aggregate level. So, for example, the best risk assessment instruments that are in existence today are true in the 70th percentile. 10 years ago they were true in the 60th percentile. But it's not like an X-ray machine where I can look and say that leg's broken. It's only true, in 70-some out of 100. Yeah. The science gets better, but we're human beings, and I don't know that we're ever going to get, as precise as an X-ray machine. But that is the right approach, and that is what we have tried to do. Also, in terms of the program interventions, which is why I lobby for the cognitive behavioral therapy, because if you look at the studies, how much that costs versus the outcome in reduced crime in the out years, it's significant. Other programs help, but that's one of the best ones. And I think that ultimately those are risk decisions. Where are you going to put your money? What's the biggest bang for your buck? When it comes to individual cases, it's still more art than science. Is this person going to come out of this unit and go kill an officer or thump on another inmate? You can give it your best educated guess, but you're only in the 70th percentile. And we tend to be very conservative, and so lots of times you say, no, not going to take that chance. Where we found our own angst was in watching people like the gentleman who left the system. We would try to find those guys we've had 3 or 4 months left to do, and go to them and say, look, we don't want to let you out of prison to the community from here. You want to make a deal and see if we can get you out in population a little bit, get you used to living on the outside. And people like Gary Jones would do behavior contracts and have that guy meet him every day and check in and see what he's doing. It takes that kind of individual investment to make sure that that high-risk situation doesn't occur if you can absolutely prevent it.
The insurance industry is more based on scientific data versus the art, and that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, but it's still actuarial for the most part. You know, they'll charge me life insurance fee at a certain rate because of my age, and I might live 40 years longer than that, or I might die tomorrow. But it's still actuarial. It's not diagnostic in the sense that, especially elected officials would like it to be, because they never want us to make mistakes. Way up here.
Yeah, thanks for coming. And I know a lot about the Montana issue because I was a prison psychiatrist for 23 years.
Wow.
And so I wouldn't want anybody to walk out of here thinking that we are really very different from what you just saw in the video. What you've done in Washington is light years ahead of what I knew up to the time I left 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And then there are all the cultures of the inmates, and I was responsible for kind of winnowing out who went where. But there's all kinds of cultures in terms of officers.
Yes.
And there's all kinds of cultures in terms of parole boards. Mm-hmm. And if you talk about a carrot and stick approach, our parole board, in my view, is very, very restrictive. So there are very few incentives. Then when you get to the federal level and you get mandatory minimums, there's no carrot at all. Right. So there's, it's a complex issue, but you've done a great job telling us what you do, but we don't do any of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I kind of purposely didn't want to learn about Montana because I wouldn't learn enough. I just wanted to talk from my own experience. That's what I have to offer.
Let's take one more question. To kind of go with what the gentleman earlier had said, who had served time and had this experience on the other side of most of us. I work with adolescents. I work with the youth, and a lot of them come from Pine Hills, which is our male juvenile detention facility, or Riverside, which is our female juvenile detention center. And they have a huge gap in services from coming from in there to out here. And I don't know enough about the adult system to really speak to it. I do know that there's a huge lack of education on this end of it for folks who've not worked on that end. Did Washington do anything to kind of lessen that gap with the folks who are working in the community with these inmates who are being released? Or was there kind of, that's where the progress is sort of at, hopefully?
If I understand correctly, are there program opportunities for people after they get out?
Where the people who are working with them are also educated on the struggles and difficulties of coming from an incredibly controlled environment to this incredibly uncontrolled environment.
Yeah.
How many resources are provided?
Not enough. There's some effort in that regard, but not enough. And we all just got hammered since 2008 with budget reductions. That's the way we were headed in trying to form local reentry councils and have people understand who was coming out to them and what they could do to help them support. And we tried to engage the inmate while they were still incarcerated with the reentry council they were going to. We did this for the highest risk offenders, again, spending our money where we thought we'd get more bang for the buck. And it was off to a pretty good start. We got a federal grant. Federal grant ran out. Everybody ran out of money, and so we had to stop doing that. I know the current administration is anxious to get back to that, but the revenue forecast in Washington isn't great at this point either. But I think that's the future. I think that needs to happen. And again, the research is clear. We need to give people heavy doses of the program interventions in prison. That needs to include some step-down process out of prison, and then those programs need to be supported and continued when they're released to the community, because most people recidivate relatively quickly, usually in the first 3 months. If you can supervise them and involve them and engage them during that period of time, the farther out you get, the less chance of recidivism. So that is the way that is what we should be doing. So thank you. It's been fun.
For coming. I really appreciate it, and I'd like to keep this dialogue open, so please feel free to email, call, or stop by and tell us your thoughts. It sounds like there's a lot of people here with a lot of really good experience in this issue, and we'd love to hear from you. So thank you very much.